This is another iRaw podcast.
It's really interesting that illuminating history is really important in that sense for reflecting on how we still think about the present. If my home discipline, psychology, which has been really slow to engage with the animals and lots of these issues, if it can start to look at its own past and these what are seen to be kind of key figures or moments in its own past, and start to pick away at the human relationships involved, but look at them in a slightly critical way, not slightly critical way, profoundly critical, then that's potentially a way for psychologists and others engaging with that discipline to think about the present. The two go together, I think, for me. That's been really interesting for me to think about history in that way, being engaged with the historical project, yeah.
Welcome back to The Animal Turn, everyone. This is season 7, episode 8. As you know, in this season, we're focused on the idea of multi-species health. And we've been speaking about a whole range of concepts related to health, everything from marginalized multi-species communities to healthy publics. But today, we're probably focused on a figure that many of us relate or think about when it comes to animals and experimentation and also questions of health. And that's Pavlov's dogs. Now, I don't know about you, but as I mentioned at the start of the interview today, I have a very superficial understanding of Pavlov and the experiments he did. I think I was just taught in primary school that he rang a bell and dogs salivated, and that was the end of the story, and he was a genius for figuring it out. Well, my guest today, Mathew Adams, has spent a lot of time learning about Pavlov and the various experiments he did while in St Petersburg, but more importantly, learning about his dogs. You see, there wasn't one dog. There was many dogs involved in Pavlov's experiments, and they were engaged in a whole host of different experimentations. Now, Mathew Adams, who I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment, has done an incredible exhibition, both online and an in-person exhibition in the UK, called The Kingdom of Dogs. You should definitely go check it out. The link is in the show notes. It's just beautifully done. The design is incredible. They've got all these little figurines that make you think about how the labs were arranged, the whole system of lab networks were arranged, and also what the dogs were doing. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Mathew. Mathew is an academic in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Brighton, UK. He teaches classes in ecopsychology, the psychology of human-animal relations, posthumanities, and creative methods. And in fact, during the course of this episode today, we speak a lot about the role of psychology and its relationship with the animal turn and animal studies in general. Mathew's research challenges conventional perceptions of animal experimentation and considers the nature of scientific work. From 2022 to 2024, he worked as an Arts and Humanities Research Council Fellow on a project entitled Pavlov and the Kingdom of Dogs, Storing Experimental Animal Histories Through Arts-Based Research, which of course we speak a lot about today. Read more about the project in the journal article Qualitative Research in Psychology, as well as Trace, Journal for Human Animal Studies, or, as I said, go and explore the online exhibition. Mathew's most recent book is titled Anthropocene Psychology, Being Human in a More Than Human World, and he's currently working on another provisionally titled An A to Z of the Anthropocene, Key Ideas for Navigating End Times and New Beginnings. Now, we did run into a couple of sound issues in this episode. You'll hear there's a little bit of clipping kind of throughout the episode, but it's not too bad. Unfortunately, near the end of the interview, there was this odd like click, 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 click sound that started, and I found it a bit too distracting. So I ended up cutting just the end of the interview where I asked him what he was currently working on. So you'll notice that the interview ends slightly more abruptly than usual. But what he did say he is working on is a standalone graphic novel about Pavlov and the Kingdom of Dogs, which is very exciting, and I'm sure more details will be available on that soon. Find out more about Mathew's work on Instagram, X, and via his university profile. All of the links are, of course, in the show notes. Priyashnu Thapliel joins us once again for the animal highlight at the end of this show, and he speaks about a dog named Ruby, also challenged some of Priya's ideas regarding the ethics of doing ethnographic research and how researchers and the dogs that they are investigating interact with one another. And when matters of health or life and death emerge, what role an ethnographer plays in that. It's a very generous and thoughtful highlight today, and I enjoyed speaking to Priya about it. Just a reminder that the Animal Highlight is also now its own standalone podcast. If you haven't found it yet on Spotify or Podchaser or wherever it is you listen, make sure you go and check it out. It's the Animal Highlight. It includes all of the segments from the Animal Turn, as well as some original content. So the last season of the Animal Highlight, I had Harry de Bont on the show, and he spoke about animals and waste. And it was a lot of fun to work with him on creating that content. Also, just a reminder to go and check out our merch store. You'd be doing the show and us a really great service and help if you got a shirt or something or other for a gift or a colleague or someone who works in animal studies. And of course, you'd be helping support myself, Christian, and Rebecca, who are doing some of the work on the Animal Turn behind the scenes. And finally, just a reminder to please rate and review the show wherever you listen. These go a long way in terms of helping others to find the content. And as always, thank you to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics, Apple, for sponsoring this podcast. They give us a little bit of money, which goes a long way in terms of helping to make sure that the website and back of house things like where the sound is stored, etc., that I have the money to make sure that that continues. And for this season's podcast sponsor, the Remaking One Health Indies project with Kritika Srinivasan. Thank you so much for all of your support. All right, this has been a really long intro. Sorry about that. Again, a fascinating conversation talking about Pavlov's dogs and also the interactions of psychology in animal studies. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the show, Matt. It's great to have you on the show to talk a little bit about your work with Pavlov's dogs and your amazing exhibition. I'm very excited to talk to you about it. But welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I love the podcast, so it's really nice to be able to contribute.
Thank you. I'm always delighted when people know the podcast, when I have guests on and they're like, hey, I know your show. I'm like, wow, yay. I get very excited. So you have a fascinating history and you do work at a whole bunch of really interesting overlaps, things that look at arts-based research, psychology, human-animal relations. What a journey. How did you come to be interested in this kind of work?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's been a bit of a journey, as you say. Originally, my work was in kind of social theory and critical psychology in relation in particular to identity. But there I got a strong interest in what we might call a relational ontology, for shorthand, which is kind of interested in a key proposition in critical psychology against individualist psychology, is that who we are, what it means to be a person, involves being constituted through our relationships with others. And that was seen as a challenge to kind of the mainstream history of psychology, and that was part of my work. And I'm mentioning that now, it might seem arcane because it's something I come back to. But after doing that for a while, including my PhD in teaching and research, I kind of had an important, for me, pivot when I shifted towards environmental issues. Actually, after a lecture I went to a public lecture, and I kind of had an epiphany that I needed to turn my research around to focus on climate crisis, ecological crisis, much more in my own work.
Wow, whose lecture was it? It's always amazing when you go to a lecture and it changes like your course of things.
Yeah, it was actually David Kidner, who was in the UK. He was a kind of critical psychologist, really looking at how social systems, social structure, politics, capitalism was central to understanding the environmental crisis, but from a much deeper historical perspective than we used to. And I'd actually done an undergraduate module with him a long time before that, and just seeing it again triggered something in me that took me back to then, and also kind of made me realise that I was going down a route of increasing technical, if you like, specialism within social theory and psychology. That would have been possibly a fruitful career path, but it just kind of awakened this desire to do something I was more passionate about and interested in. So I kind of turned the bus around gradually and started to focus probably around, I think the first article I had published on these issues was around 2012. So that's a good marker of when I started to focus more on environmental issues, still in relation to identity, but also starting to think about them in relation to narrative, cultural pathologies, cultural norms, and that built up towards a book I wrote in 2016, Ecological Crisis, Sustainability and the Psychosocial Subject, Beyond Behaviour Change. Behaviour change was, probably still is, a big kind of paradigm for how we think about
Mm.
environmental issues, particularly in psychology. And coming from a social theory and critical psychology background, I wanted to get involved with that critically and think about other ways of imagining an environmental crisis and other ways out of it.
Oh,
And
that's really interesting.
yeah,
So you're talking here now about, I mean, because people always feel, I think, a bit um, flustered's not the wrong. They feel inept. You know, the size of the crisis, the size of the issues, and this is a psychological. It's interesting. I haven't had many psychologists on the show or people that are experts in psychology, but this is inherently a psychological question: how we deal with these big existential crises and the kind of actions we take. You know, whether we throw up our hands and say, "Well, it's beyond my control," or we jump right in, maybe without thinking. Um, what is in our control. It's really fascinating, fascinating work.
yeah, thanks. And my home discipline is psychology. That's where I've ended up teaching, and so I've done a lot of work in and around psychology, mainstream and on the margin. So I was speaking to and drawing from psychological work in that book, and but I was trying to draw on other perspectives outside the mainstream, like psychoanalysis, narrative studies, and towards the end of that book, posthumanism,
Mm.
starting to engage with the animal turn, especially when I was starting to think and write about possible imaginaries that were alternatives to kind of stuck within what Naomi Klein, I think, called the kind of narrative loop that we seem to get stuck in around the climate
Oh, I
crisis.
love that, a narrative loop. Mm.
Yeah, it's like it's easier to imagine the end of the world, as someone else said, than it is to imagine different kinds of ways of imagining a future um, beyond the climate crisis that doesn't somehow involve minor behaviour changes. So
Mm.
I was looking for those kind of imaginaries, and then I started to read the work people like Donna Haraway, and for the first time for me, really, and starting to think much more about a relational ontology. So coming back to that phrase, but beyond the species boundary, beyond the species barrier. So starting to think about how what it is to be human is constituted through our relationships with the species and animals, starting to think about those things. So that was towards the end of that book. And since then, really, there's been another pivot where I focus even more on the human decentering the human animal, human other species relationships, especially in the context of the Anthropocene,
Mm.
critically engaging with that notion. So again, another marker would be a book that I published in 2021 called Anthropocene Psychology, Being Human in a More Than Human World. And there I really kind of ran with specific situated human animal and multi-species relations that I thought helped illustrate, reflect on what it means to be human, but also what it means to think about being human in a different context.
Could you give us an example of one of those that you might have walked through?
Yeah, so in one chapter, I took the example of the broiler chicken. This is what I tended to do in the chapters. I took an example to start with. So I took the example of the broiler chicken, which is a specific kind of chicken that's produced to be eaten, probably like that. And I worked with that in terms of why is that considered to be a potential marker of the Anthropocene itself? And there are reasons for that. It's seen as a specific marker along with things like fallout from nuclear testing, as in chicken bones that will end up under the ground, the scale at which we eat chickens, and the distinctive change in the size of the body, which would be recognizable in the skeleton, and they're spread across the world, means that if any future species wanted to look back and designate our particular era through looking at geology, as the Anthropocene, one of the things that would stand out would be this layer of chicken bones
Wow.
in the ground. And yeah, that kind of, the first time I come across something like that, kind of really opened my imagination to how profoundly important our relationships to the species are to how we understand and the time we're living in a way that is about humans changing the environment, possibly for the first time in its existence, to the
Mm.
extent to the extent that we are. But that is
Yeah.
always about our profound relationships with the species and our interdependence with them. So basically in that chapter I walk that through, but then I use it as an opportunity to talk about vegan imaginaries and meat culture, and engage with kind of working outwards to bigger issues, and
Mm.
start to think about what a vegan imaginary might look like on a wider scale. If more people engaged with it.
Really, really interesting. And I think, what you're talking about here with vegan imaginaries, and of course, Dinesh Wadiwell has said this as well, that what a lot of a vegan imaginary is, or practice even is trying to practice a world that doesn't yet exist. Like, what would it mean if you do these practices what is distinctly a non-vegan world? If you think that, I think what 1% of the world's population are vegan, and it's people that are actively trying to live in a world that doesn't yet exist, trying to, through practice, create this alternative world. And it does trigger imaginaries. It makes you realize, as you said earlier, that there are alternatives, that everything isn't foreclosed. The end of the world isn't predetermined. And I always find this quite interesting. I think anyone who does research with history starts to very quickly realize how what we think of as catastrophic in this moment, and this is not to belittle how serious the Anthropocene is, but that every generation has faced these massive crises where they've foreseen for their purposes and their populations the end of the world, and how adaptable we've changed, or how normalized certain situations can become over time, which I think is quite interesting. I really love that you're thinking across these different imaginaries, and I also like to think with imagination, because there is a kind of bridge between imagination and what you think is possible, and materiality, right? What actually is. And it's easy, I think, when you start to talk about imagination, for people to think it's fluffy or it's not important. But you think imaginaries are really important, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I love the way you put it a moment ago, and it's around ideas like kind of prefigurative imaginaries, which we might not be able to fully envisage or articulate. Back to David Kidner, he mentioned these kind of imaginaries as ideologically occluded. I like that. It's like that sometimes there are other systems of thinking in the way, to the extent that it's hard to think about these different imaginaries, but it's possible. And sometimes, in fact, they exist elsewhere already. And in another chapter where I talk about stranded whales as the start point for the chapter, I talk about indigenous imaginaries, which is a really difficult subject to engage with as a non-indigenous researcher. But some imaginaries that might be prefigurative or outside of our own everyday experience might have developed in different contexts in completely different ways. So this is not homogenous either. There are potential imaginaries, if we want to stick with that concept, that exist or have existed that might still be broken or fragmented, but that we can draw on as well. So we do always have a foot in history or in the present or in existing materialities, I think you're right, when we are trying to foster, facilitate other imaginaries. Yeah.
And you can never quite know. You might have an idea of what the future could look like, but those coulds, there are multiple kind of pathways. And also, the idea of even one pathway is an illusion, because you could be reaching or doing something, but different people from different contexts would maybe draw different conclusions about what it is. This is all sounding very abstract, but it's just to say, I think maybe coming back to your idea of relational ontology, I suppose, is also related to relational epistemology. How we know the world is also through our relations, right? Like and I think that this is really important in terms of how we know other animals, is to realize that they don't exist depending on the animal. So broiler chicken, for example, they don't exist outside of our relationships with them, right? The broiler and the human relationship in a factory farm setting or in a sanctuary is very much shaped through the relationship. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. You put it better than I did, but that's also what I'm trying to get. Was trying to get it in the book. Yeah, they are relational configurations. So you're absolutely right. The broiler chicken would not and does not exist out of not just humanity, but particular framing of human culture, technology, history that produces broiler chickens on such a scale, and in such a way. So yeah, totally within that framework is how we and those animals are configured. We're also configured at the same time as in the way that we are people that eat chickens and all the things that come with that, in terms of the systems that we're part of. So,
yeah, really, really interesting to think about the relationships and what it means in terms of how it opens opportunities to act or it forecloses opportunities to act for different beings. But now, of course, when we're talking now about imaginaries and health, I think is a particularly powerful imaginary, right? Like the idea of a healthy body or a healthy environment. This is also central to environmental discourse. We live in a healthy environment, or that's what we want. So it's an extremely powerful discourse and imaginary. And of course, who we're talking about today, Pavlov, he was really a historical figure when it came to thinking about health and psychology in particular. So we're going to talk about Pavlov's dogs, but maybe we could start with Pavlov, because I think we all think we know. We all like, oh, Pavlov, like everyone knows the story. He's the guy who figured out that dogs salivate when they hear a bell. And it sounds all really benign. It sounds really benign. I always imagined Pavlov like standing in his garden. He was some guy who just rang a bell and realized that there was extra drool on the dog's mouth. It really was benign in my imaginary. But that's not what happened. So could you tell us a little bit about Pavlov and why he features so prominently in our minds when we think about psychology and animal health?
So I think probably a couple of things to say about Pavlov in terms of that imaginary. And the first is that I was like you, even though I'm rooted in psychology, the way that I'd learned about psychology and the way I teach it was that I didn't have much more of an idea about what he did in detail. He didn't need to kind of engage with that. But yeah, Pavlov. So he actually spent the first big part of his career as a physiologist, and health is central to his work then. He was looking at digestive processes in dogs. That's what he won the Nobel Prize for. That's not what it's particularly remembered for today. But he was, and there's a kind of real tension there around, if we want to think around health, around the way that he worked with dogs and treated them in discovering and presenting knowledge around digestive processes. There's an irony, at least there, in that the focus was on human health around discoveries around digestive processes. But with dogs, the experiments on dogs that were involved in those discoveries were, pretty horrendous by any standard. But then what is remembered for today is the work that he did after the Nobel Prize, so from the early 20th century onwards, which was physiopsychological, or we might think of it as psychology today, and that's the work with dogs in terms of the conditional reflex. So by then he was getting into his 40s, maybe even 50s by then. Yeah, into his 50s. So he was an established scientist living in St Petersburg, which was then Petrograd by then, renamed in World War One. He had a large factory enterprise. I say factory enterprise after the historian Daniel Toews, because he was working on such a large scale across multiple laboratories, lots of co-workers employed by him, as well as dog handlers, multiple experiments underway at any one time, increasingly geared only towards the study of the conditional reflex, which does relate to a kind of common image of what Pavlov was doing, in that he was collecting saliva, which required a kind of surgical intervention in the cheek or throat, the saliva gland. Initially, the dog would have been presented with food, and then saliva measured. How much did the dog salivate when presented with food? Then the food would have been paired with, he never actually used a bell, but with a metronome or a buzzing sound, or lots of other stimuli as well, which we don't tend to hear about. Some of them, which the euphemism was destructive stimuli or negative stimuli, that was the infliction of pain. Also a real kind of odd array of stimuli, such as the sound of water dripping, or different shapes or different colours. So a real range of stimuli, all for him geared towards trying to discover not just learning processes, but psychological mechanisms behind them as well, that he thought we could reach through this measure of saliva and changes in salivation.
What made Pavlov choose dogs for this experiment? Why dogs?
He was a real advocate of working with dogs, and worked with dogs right up until the end of his life. The only other animals he really worked with at all were apes, and then he wasn't leading that research. That's because he thought they were pliable, obedient, and also, at least in terms of public accounts, that he thought they were kind of man's best friend. So it was an honourable and historical relationship, that we had this bond that no other human and animal had. And that kind of made their sacrifice more honourable in a way, in that they were, that we had this long allegiance with them.
I always find it interesting how the idea that we have this bond, that we have this relationship, that somehow we've been, as we were talking about earlier, co-constituted, warrants us using them in that way. It seems like a bigger betrayal if that's what you believe. If you believe that we've got this really strong, not to say that any animals should be tested on or that that's fair or ethical, but there just seems to be something even more egregious when somehow you're choosing an animal who you willingly admit to being your friend and loyal. And I don't know, it just seems like a double betrayal somehow. But it's really quite remarkable looking at your exhibition. So you've got this online exhibition. It was an in-person exhibition, and you've done graphic novels and a whole host of posters that really, I think, bring to life the scale and the magnitude of these experiments. And as you said, so there wasn't even a bell, which is quite remarkable. But there were multiple dogs, hundreds of dogs, and they went through all of these, that cheek. So it's called a fistula, right? A fistula in the cheek. And you had this pipe running down the dogs, running down, collecting the gastric fluids that were being sold. Like, what? And then you've got them tied up to these little they seem like wooden carts where people have literally tied them in place and are feeding them and doing a range of experiments. So it's just a massive, massive, massive operation, right?
Yeah, it was an enterprise is what I tend to call it. But yeah, it was enormous. And yeah, you're right. He has significant state funding, effectively, and that only increased as his global celebrity increased. And he recruited hundreds of dogs. And yeah, if we want to, if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, if you want to imagine it, in St Petersburg, there were different laboratory setups across the city, but what they had in common was this kind of standard central image of a dog tied to an experimental stand. So when we look back at archival images, it's not kind of the pristine technology we might think of today. It seems ad hoc, so they were tied with harnesses and ropes and buckles and almost whatever they had to hand on these wooden stands. The dogs had to be held in place. And if there were dogs used for the stimulus experiments, conditional reflex experiments, then they would at the very least have had a fistula attached to their cheek, which was surgical, which was an operation, and then another device attached so that saliva could be extracted and measured. And then in that place there would be another human co-worker who was assigned to the dog for a series of trials. They would run for often hours and hours at a time. And that's the repeated presentation of food initially, but then a stimuli, whatever that might be, whether it's a flashing light bulb or electrocution, and measuring the results of that again and again and again. But at least initially, there were lots of these experiments happening in the same room. Later on, when Pavlov had more resources, they might have been in separate chambers or separated partitions within a room. And yeah, dozens of experiments underway at any one time, Pavlov overseeing them. So not conducting any of them, but overseeing.
What seemed quite different to maybe how we think about lab animals today, and maybe I'm wrong, you know this better, is these animals were named, they were known individually. I really enjoyed the kind of section on the online exhibition where you spoke about, was it other notes or other observations, where the researchers who were paired with different dogs had to not only note the outcomes of the tests, some of which were pretty, like the amount of gastric juice. So what was it? One of the dogs produced a liter of juice, like gastric juice, every day for 2 years. I mean, that's a massive amount. And literally, so the food is falling out of the dog's mouth. He's never actually getting to consume the food. He eats it and falls out. He eats it and he falls out, which is just really tragic. But then in these notes, the people who are paired with them are writing really intimate details about the dogs. You start to get a sense of how much these experiments are changing their personalities and impacting them. Did you ever get a sense that those who are experimenting on them are uncomfortable with what's happening? Or at this stage, was it readily accepted that animals are available to use in experimentation?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. And The first thing to say about those other observations is what we really wanted to do, and what I discovered the more I delved into kind of the detail. I didn't just want to kind of damn Pavlov in retrospect. Not only that, some of the experiments were horrific, there's no doubt about it. He was a complicated man. But I didn't just want to do that. I wanted to explore the complexities of the things we talked about already, the relationships that were involved and any contradictions or tensions there. And one of those contradictions or tensions was definitely around the naming of animals. And certainly as Pavlov moved into that later work, which we talked about earlier, he encouraged, in fact, insisted that the dogs were named. They all had names. And then they were assigned to a co-worker, often for months, sometimes years. So there was a named dog working with one person. So yeah, what did that mean? How did that mean the co-workers felt about that relationship with the dogs? We don't know for sure because those records, lots of records were actually lost in the siege of Leningrad in World War II. But what remains, certainly those that I've been able to find, don't really record much about co-workers' feelings towards the dogs per se. The other observations are geared towards how they conduct themselves in experiments, but also lots of commentary about their personality. So implied there is, if not care, then at least an attentiveness to the complexity of a dog's personality. Pavlov, people often think that Pavlov didn't, as a behaviourist, didn't want to talk about a dog's interiority. Not the case at all. He was really interested in a dog's character or personality as well. But there are other accounts from the time of, for example, students in the audience that were disgusted by particularly the sham feeding system that you saw. But there was also, we have to remember, a fairly nascent but already quite strong anti-vivisectionist movement globally and in Russia that did call out Pavlov's methods. So it certainly wasn't the case that everyone accepted the sacrifice of animals because of some kind of acceptance of science more generally at the time. There were other voices, dissenting voices, whether I imagine that some co-workers at least must have been aware of these and been uncomfortable to some degree in that work. Whether they could then justify it to themselves or each other in a fairly straightforward way, I'm not sure.
We're now in the early 20th century, right? This is
Yeah.
all happening early 20th century. Okay, and the brown dog affair is kind of happening. There's been a lot of flare up with the anti-vivisectionists. So, I mean, for sure, they are aware that not everyone likes what they're doing. But oftentimes, I think activists also framed as maybe being too emotional. And if you're in the business and the work of doing this work, maybe you're putting that aside. But some of these observations were really quite intimate, I think, in terms of detail. So, like you said, there was an attentiveness. One of them spoke about a dog who had gone through an electric testing of sorts. I think the name was Shaolin, and spoke about how the dog was really energetic, happy, and noted a change in the dog's behavior following the trials, that the dog had become apathetic since the trials had begun, that there was a marked personality change in the dog pre and post. And this seems obvious to us, right? Like if you undergo torture, your personality is going to change. But this is a pretty remarkable observation for the time because animals weren't thought to have personalities, right?
Yeah, yes, I think you're right. And certainly wasn't a norm for it to appear in scientific discourse. So, yeah, that kind of the level of focus on health and harm to the dogs involved, I think, does stand out, even at the time in terms of how those kinds of experiments were documented. What I'm also still curious about is whether it's still written quite flatly, or if you like, dispassionately in terms of what happens to the dogs, and that's partly what kind of still makes me feel really uncomfortable or generates an emotional response in me is that you're right. Some of it, of course, it's obvious. The dogs are being tortured, they break. What do you expect? And it's kind of, you want to say, come on, but it's still written dispassionately as if this is some kind of discovery. I'm still curious as to to what extent this is just the standards of scientific writing, which again, Pavlov oversaw every public pronouncement, publication that came out of the enterprise. To what extent is scientific writing, or to what extent is it an actual reflection of people's sensibilities at the time? To some extent, that remains a mystery. But yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, because this is also a time in which dogs' relationships with people I want to say Western cities, but here we're in Russia now as well, where dogs' relationships with people, or let's say urbanites, is changing quite dramatically. You're getting more and more dogs being kept in homes, whereas maybe this wasn't the case 50 years prior, right? So there's increasing understandings, I think, of dogs, or dogs are engaged in different kinds of relationships. And maybe this is why we get so sensitive about it today, because for us in the UK and in Vienna and in Canada, and, dogs are pets for many of us. And in this season so far, so we've had a bit of quite a explicit focus on dogs. We've spoken about the health of street dogs. We've spoken a bit about the health of pet dogs and how oftentimes we don't actually know what they need, but in general, it's pretty clear that many dogs are suffering for different reasons on the streets or in homes. But perhaps neglected have been lab dogs, dogs in laboratories that are engaged in this type of labor, that are being used in these ways. In looking at the history of experimentation on dogs with Pavlov, did you also find yourself looking at experimentation with dogs today?
Yeah, again, it's a really nice question. In some ways, I thought of this as a historical case study, but I've always been interested before this in contemporary human-animal relations, and including in the classes I teach around psychology of human-animal relations, how we treat experimental animals today. And it's certainly still a debate, and it's certainly still something that requires critical engagement with, and no doubt reform. I'm not sure to what extent that involves dogs, but certainly around other animals that are engaged in research in psychology and other areas of science, there's still people, academics, researchers, animal welfareists pushing for reform. And that can still be around things that I talk about in this project, like things like naming, where that can be just not present as a practice, but also paying attention to how animals are housed, their daily routines, their daily lives, their health. So these are the things that are being still called for in animal research today. And these are the things that we drew out. And it almost feels coincidental sometimes in the historical case study, things we discovered. We start to focus on their daily lives, on the names that they were given, their relationships with the handlers, their living conditions. And these are still exactly the same things often. They just carry over to really contemporary arguments and debates around how animals in research should be treated, if we should research them at all, which is a bigger question, of course. But if they are, what are the protocols around it still being debated in some of the same ways. So for me, it's really interesting that illuminating history is really important in that sense for reflecting on how we still think about the present. If my home discipline, psychology, which has been really slow to engage with the animals and lots of these issues, if it can start to look at its own past and these what are seen to be kind of key figures or moments in its own past, and start to pick away at the human relationships involved, but look at them in a slightly critical way, not slightly critical way, profoundly critical, then that's potentially a way for psychologists and others engaging with that discipline to think about the present. The two go together, I think, for me. That's been really interesting for me to think about history in that way, being engaged with a historical project, yeah.
What makes you say that psychology has been slow to the mark when it comes to thinking about human and animal relations?
I say it's been slow because for some years, at least 10 years, possibly even longer in some cases, there's been an engagement with human-animal relations and the psychology of them. But I'm pretty confident in saying that in most cases, that's been about human attitudes towards animals, or it's been about how animals might be considered in animal assisted interventions, or how they might benefit human health as companion animals. What hasn't really infiltrated psychological theory and research a great deal, though it's changing, is the animal side of those relationships. What's it like for the animal? What are the animal's interests and concerns? They're not front and center in psychological research and theory. Like I say, that's changing, but whereas in sociology, anthropology, social theory, posthumanities, there's been already much more of a history of a critical engagement with those kinds of issues.
It's so tricky because I think animal studies almost inherently straddles multiple disciplines, right? And I think when you start to ask about the psychology of other animals, I'm sure some people and their disciplinary boundaries are like, wait, hang on. You're now entering the realm of ethology or ecology or animal welfare science, right? And I think maybe if you start to speak about animal psychology, a great deal's been learnt about animals' psychologies, why they act the way they do, why they respond the ways they do, but it's often been done with a pretty instrumental lens, right? A lot of animal welfare science is informed by agricultural sciences and agricultural industries. So what role do you think, is there something different psychology would do to what animal welfare science is doing? What is the contribution there? How does it push our conversations about human animal psychology forward?
I think for me, to kind of think of it as something distinctive, even though, like you say, they're overlapping, it's interdisciplinary space about psychology. It's about the psychology of human-animal relations. So it's understanding how humans and animals interrelate, encounter each other, sociality. So thinking through those kinds of moments and encounters. And psychology has been doing that, but it's been thinking about it only in terms of human attitudes towards those animals, often. So I think there's a space there still to be opened up by thinking about relationships and relationality in psychology, but saying our engagement with non-human animals and other species, we ought to start to take that on board as something that psychology could be interested in, because that then expands how we think about what social psychology means, or what we think scope of justice might be in psychology. It might extend how we think about in-groups and out-groups if we go beyond humans, start to think about relationships with non-human animals in those ways. So a relatively straightforward way is extending the concepts we use in psychology to incorporate things other than human, which it doesn't tend to do. It tends to be resolutely human exceptionalist.
Could you give me an example? Because I could see some people being worried that this is possibly dangerous ground for anthropocentrism, right? Where we look at our dogs and we say, my dog is depressed. Because a lot of people might think, oh, there's loads of psychology around dogs and dog anxiety and dog depression or whatever, which I have no doubt that does exist in numerous cases. But yeah, like if you could you give me an example to help me get my head around this a little?
Yeah, so and the kind of recent history of psychology helps evaluate, make sense of animal-assisted interventions, animal-assisted therapy, let's say, to keep it straight. And that's the use of animals, often dogs, in therapy for humans, and that all sorts of range of different practices there. But the evaluations and the theorizations to date tends to be around how might these animals benefit human health, whether in theory or in practice. It might be a before and after measurement of human health or well-being in some way. It might be a broader evaluation of a project, and it might also be theoretically around why is it something around biophilia, let's say, why do humans benefit from engagement with dogs? Now, what's missing from that, admittedly crude description so far is any consideration at all of the dogs as a meaningful part of this relationship, or the animals. They're outside of the kind of the zone of consideration.
They're objects.
Yeah, they're objects. They might as well, I've said this before, they might as well be robot dogs in terms of the way that the theory and the practice is often framed. So a relatively straightforward step for psychology, but I'll come back to your point about anthropomorphism in a moment, is what's the dog's health or the animal's health in this situation? Are we considering that? And back to those other questions we were asking earlier around what are their conditions before and after the moment of therapy or intervention? Is that a concern for psychologists? Well, I would say it absolutely is. And that doesn't necessarily mean we then have to engage in depth with dog psychology. We might want to work with animal welfareists or ethologists to understand better and better interpret what a dog's health or emotional response is in that moment, as well as a history of dogs or a history of engagement in these kinds of processes. But for me, psychology, to social psychology or a health psychology interested in something like animal-assisted interventions, needs to be able to look outside that moment of the intervention and needs to look outside of it from an exceptionally human point of view.
So just to make sure I'm with you, I mean, I think that makes complete sense. So what you're saying is there's this relationship, there's this health intervention that we put forward, often saying it's good for humans. You've got this ailment where a dog is going to help you get through this. And you're saying, well, hang on, there are two parties at play here. We need to understand what fostering this kind of relationship means for dogs' health too. So just like the dog we spoke about earlier, where pre and post, and this was shock treatment, but I mean, it's come up often enough on this podcast, the question of, are humans good for dogs? Maybe having that question at a species level is not always helpful, but in specific, it's an empirical question. We need to go in and say, well, how often do dogs engage in this type of labor or in these types of experiments, and their psychology undergoes changes? This is an empirical question that psychologists should be interested in.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, Richard Gorman's done some nice work on this in geography, animal geography, I suppose you'd call it, maybe, but around care farms particularly. But he asks a really simple question, which I think is brilliant, and then does a continuum, which is who benefits and how. And he asks who benefits and how, but of course he includes not just humans in that, but the other creatures, non-humans involved in that kind of intervention, like a care farm. And when I wrote about this, I said that question is a pertinent question for all sorts of settings, specific situations that we should be asking. As psychologists, if that's what you are, if you're doing empirical research in that kind of area, yeah, for sure.
You said you wanted to come back to the anthropomorphism point, and then I interrupted you.
Yeah, so no, it's fine. I just think that I don't think to do work that takes animal sensibilities seriously, you don't necessarily have to go too far. I mean, there's always a danger down some kind of anthropomorphism route. You don't have to say the dog is really unhappy here and project all sorts of human emotions. I get that it's really complex, but we still should try at least and ask the question, who benefits and how? And if we are doing that and we're going to try and answer it, we need to use the tools we've got at our disposal, which may be outside of your disciplinary expertise, if you're evaluating an animal-assisted intervention, for example, to make some judgment about that, a dog's welfare, for example, in that situation.
And I mean, I don't think, it's come up several times on the show, but people have strong views on anthropomorphic methods. I always switch up whether I'm going to say anthropocentric or anthropomorphic, but you know what I mean. And I think that I'm in the camp that says we can't understand the world outside of our brains. We just need to we are human. We apply these kinds of logics constantly to understand one another and to understand other animals, but we need to do it with caution, right? To appreciate that other animals experience the world with different senses. For example, dogs have a really profound sense of smell that they literally see the world. You speak to Alexandra Horowitz, right? Dogs see with smell. And that's a remarkably different way of experiencing the world. So to kind of hold in tension that you're maybe not wrong if you see a dog that's sad. And that's an important observation, while at the same time recognizing that our ability to fully comprehend the way they experience is always going to be limited, right?
Exactly. I say the same. There's a divide there that can't be bridged for me, and we should be aware of it, and that should bring some humility, which is always important. There's always something noble about that divide, and yeah, it's always with caution, always revisable. But I think if we make a move to at least try and consider other interests with care, then that's a step in the right direction.
I wanted to ask, because you've clearly got a very animal focus now, and earlier on when we were speaking about your history and your journey, you had said that you'd find yourself kind of in a post-humanism camp or postmodern camp of sorts. But animal studies is obviously, you're not giving kind of agency to the table and the fistula that we spoke about, where you might get some other scholars that are kind of talking maybe actor network theory, for example, or where they're saying, the table is as much an actor in this process as anything else. But you've clearly got a very animal focus. How did you find yourself coming to that point?
Yeah, I think for me, it's kind of in the work that I've done in it so far, you have to draw some boundaries around the work that you do, and I've drawn some boundaries around kind of sentient life, but that is always, again, revisable, and I'm still learning. So I guess what I've done in terms of engaging with the post-humanities, I've engaged with particular scholars and particular work, and that work is initially inspired by Donna Haraway, but Donna Haraway's later work, which is much more focused on kind of the method multispecies. And so for me, I've taken that, and then I've focused always on specific situated cases for the most part. and they have been around human-animal and multi-species relationships because it's in the context of the Anthropocene, or in the case with the Pavlov project, the history of psychology. So in a way, it's a fudge. I've skirted around some of these bigger issues around, well, if it's post-humanities, posthumanism, then what about the agency of, not just other animals or other species, but the non-human objects? And I find that fascinating, especially at the moment now, I'm trying to explore ideas around animism. But yeah, I've maintained a focus on one case at a time, I suppose.
I gotta say, I find it a bit uncomfortable applying agency to objects, as we were talking about earlier. For me, there's something markedly different about a dog and a table. So when I'm speaking about, but it's not to say that they don't have impacts on the world. That, again, like you, I'm still learning from this field, but I'm quite content with my focus on animals.
Well, there's something that messes with that a bit for me, and that's as I start to think more about the agency of things like landscape, or let's say rivers, or not just trees. But one chapter in the Anthropocene Psychology book where I start to engage with agency is shared between, let's say, a network that involves trees, but also might involve what's going on underground. So that kind of, I'm aware that I don't know enough about that, but when you start to think about rights of nature, then you're also implying a certain agency to a river or to a mountain, and that gets more complicated, doesn't it? For me, it's more complicated than thinking about the agency of a specific species or animal, or even a specific kind of entanglement of animals, is when you start to think about an agency that obviously involves multiple species, like a particular place. So
I think this is why I've always sat with the concept of subject instead of agent, because it gets really, because I mean, again, going back to your early idea of co-constituted, right? You could think about how a river co-constitutes particular humans or animals' behaviors, right? Like literally draws animals and humans to it. But at the same time, how the animals and humans who utilize the river change the river through their utilization. So you can definitely see that kind of co-constitutive interaction. But yes, we're going down the philosophical road. That's really interesting and nourishing for the soul, but there is no, it's really fascinating. While I've got you though, I really want to talk a little bit about your methods, because you use fascinating methods. Arts-based research is a passion of yours that you're clearly behind. The effort and energy that went into creating this exhibition was remarkable. Could you tell us a little bit about why you think arts-based research is so important, and maybe a bit of the nuts and bolts that came to making an exhibition like the one you did?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think it's really important in the context of animal studies or critical animal studies, or this kind of difficult to name area, especially because I think for me it tends to be, I think it's really, really important area, really significant, and that's why I've pivoted towards it. But I think it can tend to feel like it's an internal academic conversation sometimes, and the ideas that are developed around the post-humanities particularly can seem really complex and off-putting. And so I'm really, really keen on finding research methods and means of dissemination that in all sorts of different ways try and share those ideas with a wider audience, and especially non-academic audiences. And for me, as someone who's always been interested in storytelling and visual art, then it seemed like a real natural fit to try and use methods in arts-based research to tell stories related to animal studies that can do that can reach wider audiences. And that is also why I picked Pavlov, because he's a kind of already a familiar. And so I think the process of making art is a really nice way of defamiliarizing for an audience that might have a sense of what he's about already. So yeah, the nuts and bolts was that I'm not an artist, so this is collaborative right from the beginning. And when I did this work thanks to an AHRC fellowship, Arts and Humanities Research Council fellowship in the UK, and what that fellowship allowed me to do was pay collaborators to work with me to develop the art. So that meant I worked with, in the case of the exhibition, I did some initial desk-based research, building on the research I'd already done, looking at biographies and archives around Pavlov's life and more detail about the dog's lives. And I built from there a design brief where I started to imagine different scale models. This is the form of art that I chose. It was dioramas often, kind of scale models involving multiple figures, buildings, scenes at different scales that would tell the story of Pavlov's working methods and his relationship with the dogs. And I decided on 9 or 10 of these. We ended up making 7 or 8 of them. We say we. So at that stage, I started working with particularly a model maker, Jim Wilson, but also a graphic designer, Luna Stevens, and a printmaker, Rose. And the idea there was to focus on multimedia, but develop this as a kind of series of models, 3-dimensional. And for each one, then it was kind of iterative. We started to build the models. We started to think about what they looked like. And as we did that, we went back to the scrapbooks that I'd made that were kind of a visual reference point. Start to think about audience interaction with those models. Start to think about how we were representing the human-animal relationships involved, the kind of tone that we were going for. All sorts of questions come up in those moments. And it was a constant back and forward, often in the physical space of a workshop. As I gained some skills around graphic design, so the course, the fellowship allowed me to do that. I got involved in some of the labour of making the models, only the basic stuff, because I didn't have the skills to do the craft work. And yeah, we were lucky enough to be able to do that over the period of, say, 12 months. And
oh wow, that's pretty quick for such a remarkable canon of work. Like that's.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was quite intense, but once with the build was on, it was that toing and froing, that focus. And at the same time, I was working on the text that would accompany them, working with Simon Smith, who did some really nice audio stories that went with it, and they were relatively immersive in terms of the soundtrack. And working with Lena on the kind of visual angle, we focus on the kind of constructivist aesthetic to capture the kind of time as well, late 19th, early 20th century. And the focus is always on bringing these together in terms of an audience experience. So, yeah, we kind of maintained that progress and over a year. And for me, we just kept coming back to this focus on we wanted to tell the stories of the human-animal relationships involved. And, yeah, we just kept coming back to that. And luckily, we had enough kind of archival resources and textual resources to get somewhere we were satisfied with that in the end.
I really, really enjoyed the dioramas. And I think, I mean, the complexity of them, what's lovely, coming back to what you were saying about communication and also trying to convey the complexity, is each of the dioramas seem to create an opening, right? You put forward multiple figures. There are multiple little human figures and dog figures and trees and little bits and bobs happening that draw you in, right? You find yourself leaning in to say, like, what is that person by that bush doing? Or what's going on over there? And I think there's something very powerful in that act of asking the question, why are they throwing dogs off this wall over here? And for the audience, I think what your dioramas do quite powerfully is prompt us to ask questions, more questions than we've ever asked about Pavlov and his dogs. And I think there's something subversive in that. There's something subversive in finding yourself stopping and staring and being curious actually about this relationship. And of course, I didn't get to see the physical exhibition. I engaged with it online, but I still found myself zooming in and being like, what are these people doing? And I very much appreciated the audio and it's very accessible. It's, I very, very, very much enjoy, and I hope one day to do something as cool as what you've done. Have you had a good reception since launching it? Have you had a good response to what you did?
Yeah. But thanks for that response. I mean, that's really nice to hear that it kind of drew you in, and we really did aim not to be too explicitly didactic or pejorative. We wanted to invite people in and represent what we'd discovered, because for us that was enough. Of course, there was some interpretation involved, but we wanted people to come to pay attention and come to their own decisions about what was going on. And that's actually considered to be one of the strengths of ABR art-based research itself, is that it can create that, it can allow for that space of ambiguity and attentiveness, which then can require a bit more investment and attentiveness to what they see and ask more questions and so on. People felt that they were drawn in. We really tried to pay attention to the beauty of the thing as an object, whilst also being fully aware that some of it was repelling, as in some of the detail of the experiments, whether visually or in the text. And people often reported to us that they felt this real kind of this tension. They were drawn in. They did really engage with it aesthetically, but at the same time, they were kind of repelled by some of the detail. As you said, thankfully, lots of people said it really made them think about what they didn't know, about what we're not told normally about these kinds of experiments, about some of what happens outside of the moment of an encounter like this. I hope in ways more powerful and more interesting than if we'd just said, look at this, wasn't it horrible? They did this, and this, In its simplest terms, that's what we could have done, but by using models, 3D, arts, design, and so on, that's what we were trying to encourage, that kind of a deeper, maybe more unpredictable, but more sophisticated engagement with the issues.
Remarkable work. So bringing this back to the theme of the season, why do you think stuff like arts-based research, or even thinking about Pavlov, why, when we're thinking about multi-species health, should we be interested in people like Pavlov or the experiments that he did on his dogs?
Yeah, it's a nice bigger question, isn't it? I think that when we look at specific case studies like this, it speaks to this bigger question of multi-species health, because how we understand moments in history, how we understand the practice of science is really important in terms of how we understand everything else, I think. So if we start to look at a particular case study like Pavlov, whether you're a psychologist in your own history or not, you've got this sense of this moment that happened. And as you said right at the beginning of this interview, it's fairly benign, probably. And we tend to think of it as producing laws as well around particular psychological mechanisms that are universal. We haven't really had a chance to talk about this today, but that's also something that's questioned in the exhibition, this idea that those studies really did produce kind of definite knowledge. It actually didn't. It was far more revisable. And that's partly because of the liveliness and unpredictability of the animals involved and our relationships with them. So I think as soon as we start to unpack what we consider to be a contained moment like that in terms of who was involved and what happened and the detail, then it can at least encourage us to think much more about our entanglements and our encounters with other species and other animals in science and elsewhere in more subtle and more complex ways, not least in terms of broader concepts of health around who's involved and what the outcomes are of these kinds of practices.
Yeah, I mean, look at what we've done here today. We've spoken about the health of lab dogs, we've spoken about history, we've spoken about arts-based research, because, there's a centrifugal force of sorts. You kind of spin outwards and think, okay, how do I think in more, and also historically located ways to realize that things change over time, but they also oddly stay the same. So having these conversations is really significant. Do you have a quote ready for us?
I do, yeah. So it's not about Pavlov in particular. I wanted to broaden it out a little bit. What I thought would be the stage of the conversation. So I'd like to quote the words of the remarkable Australian environmental philosopher, late philosopher Val Plumwood. And it's from the final words of an article that was published posthumously around 2009. And this is it. She finishes an article by saying, "Help us reimagine the world in richer terms that will allow us to find ourselves in dialogue with and limited by other species' needs, other kinds of minds. I'm not going to try to tell you how to do it. There are many ways to do it, but I hope I have convinced you that this is not a dilettante project. The struggle to think differently, to remake our reductionist culture, is a basic survival project in our present context. I hope you will join it."
Beautiful. And that so captures what we've spoken about today, is how to foster imaginations that resist reduction. That's really what you've been saying throughout the conversation today. Remarkable.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Yeah, I'm really drawn to it again and again, so I thought that was something I should quote today.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I enjoyed learning a little bit more about Pavlov and his dogs, and psychology and arts-based research. So thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Hello, Priya. Welcome back to the Animal Highlight. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Claudia. Thank you for having me again.
I'm very excited actually about today's episode, because we're going to be talking a little bit about methodologies, right?
Yes, that's true. So I thought I'll be talking about one of my research participants, Ruby.
Mhm.
So just like Pavlov and his research assistants, I also spent months of my research time observing dogs and getting to know them as individuals, identifying them by their names, habits, and personality traits. And like Pavlov, I also formed what I thought of as working relationships with the dogs I was studying. So while labs such as Pavlov's, where dogs and their bodies are actively experimented on, have been heavily criticized, as such, they have become sites of regulation and critical debate. But what about conducting observations of dogs outside these lab settings? So, through the story of Ruby today, one of the dogs whom I worked with in Uttarakhand, India, I will try to unpack some of the ethical engagements of conducting multi species ethnography. That was my methodology.
We often think, like you say, about the significance of ethics and how we conduct research in labs, even though, they still get away with doing pretty awful and horrible things in labs. But research ethics is not really applied or thought about as much when it comes to kind of the social field or doing ethnography where we're observing animals and their social lives, not necessarily when we're conducting experiments on them. So really, really interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely. When I was also planning my research, also I could not find a lot of literature on specifically talking about ethics, but I think it's a growing field. Hopefully, most literature will come out on it, and yeah. So today also, I thought that it would be interesting to think about and maybe provoke some questions and reflections.
So tell us
Yeah,
more about Ruby.
so Ruby is a young, slender dog with a short brown, patchy fur. So when I first met her during my fieldwork in the winter months of 2023, she spent most of her time outside a small tea and snack shop run by Lalitaji, just outside the main market street. On my daily walks to the market, I was accustomed to spotting Ruby outside Lalitaji's shop. So when I did not observe her there for 3 consecutive days, I went to Lalitaji's to inquire. Lalitaji told me that Ruby had not been well for a few days. At first, she thought that a leopard had taken her, but then Lalitaji found Ruby behind a haystack a few feet from her shop. I went with Lalitaji to find Ruby curled up at the base of the haystack. She was coughing profusely. Lalitaji said that her neighbor speculated that Ruby must have swallowed a fish bone that is now stuck in her throat. According to her, there was nothing we could do except wait for Ruby to either cough up the bone or the bone to eventually pass through her gut. For the next few days, I checked in on Ruby while on my way to and from the market. She grew extremely thin and her coughing persisted, even worsening. Lalitaji kept offering Ruby food and water, but her appetite also deteriorated. Some local passers by asked me whose dog Ruby was, as they were also concerned for her health. When I told them that she lived on the street, one of them dejectedly said that there was not much hope for her anymore and it has started to frost at night. A couple of times on our way back from the market, my friends and I covered Ruby's body with hay to keep her warm through the night. Other times, I noticed that someone else had done the same. Ruby, it seemed, had her anonymous well wishers. Then one morning, I was walking to the market with Puranda, a local resident, when he pointed out Ruby and said that he had noticed she was sick for some time now. I told him that I had also been observing her health. When he found that out, Puranda turned to me with a confused look and said, and I quote, "What kind of doctor are you? This dog is suffering and dying in front of you, and you do nothing." It was a common misunderstanding. Even though I repeatedly made clear to everyone that I am not a veterinary doctor, people insisted on calling me Dr. Sahab or Dr. Sir. They expected me to take care of the dogs I was writing about. Before Puranda, Abhay, a local high schooler, had also approached me about Ruby. He passionately appealed to me. Dr. Sahab, the condition of that dog is very bad. Do something, otherwise, she will die. My cluelessness and insistence on not providing any medical advice or treatment did not deter people from calling me when any of the dogs or animals got sick, pregnant, or injured. It sort of became a running joke among some of my friends in the village. That day, on hearing Purandar's remark, I turned and gave him my standard response stating that I am not a medical doctor. Without a pause, he rebutted, and I quote, "But you are studying them. You will write a PhD using them, but what do these dogs get from you in return? I have never seen you give them food or medicines." Purandar's comments stayed with me and made me uncomfortable. As part of standard codes of ethical research practice, I mostly tried to be distant from and indifferent towards the dogs whom I observed. I refrained from approaching any dog myself. Only if a dog approached me, I touched their face or scratched their head as a way of introductions and trust building. I never gave them any food, nor I got involved in taking care of them. I always told myself that I was here to observe and not make dogs and people dependent on my presence. If I feed the dogs and take care of them myself, what happens when I leave? What biases will my interventions in the lives of dogs create in my ability to objectively collect data about genuine human dog interactions in my field sites? The concern for these dependencies and potential biases in my research informed how I conducted myself in my field sites. But was my stance something that my research participants, especially the dogs, agreed with? One evening, after checking up on Ruby, I was talking with Lalitaji's neighbor Mohanty when I suddenly felt something pressing on my leg. I looked down to see Ruby, who she was gently resting her face against my pants. Mohanji said, "Look, she's asking you to give her food, to take care of her." I told Mohanji that he shouldn't worry at all, as Ruby received food from Lalitaji's shop. I conveniently washed my hands of any responsibility. But if I take Ruby's actions as her intentions, that evening she was demanding me to acknowledge her and her needs. The reproaches and demands from my human and dog participants eventually made me change my research approach. Rather than a totally passive observer, I became more of a responsive researcher who tried to respond to the ethical claims made on me by my research participants. I sent a video of Ruby to the government vet in a nearby town. It turned out that she did not have a fishbone stuck in her throat, but that she had a viral flu. I gave some medicines to her from a local chemist and personally administered some of the medicines before giving the rest to Lalitaji and her neighbors. Ruby's story opens up opportunities to reflect on the ethical basis on which we conduct our research. When it comes to thinking about how animals are used in the production of knowledge, particularly as it relates to health, we frequently think about the animals who are kept and tested on labs. Like many dogs in labs today, Pavlov's dogs were subjected to numerous experiments that intervened on their bodies and their autonomy. While historically it was believed that these measures are necessary to produce sound science and knowledge, these assumptions are increasingly being questioned and critiqued. But lab experiments are only one side of knowledge production. Work like mine that relies on observation and participant interaction to produce data, often called multispecies ethnography, is becoming increasingly popular. I also relied on my participants to make the knowledge about multi-species health. But what ethical obligations did I have towards them and to their health? Ruby's story poses some important questions about the ethics of researching with and about animals.
I love this episode today, Priya. You've raised such important questions and thoughts, and I don't think that there are any clear answers to these. Right? You can definitely see how not responding, not helping Ruby, observing her plight would offer significant insights into understanding the lives of street dogs, right? How their deaths are managed, how the ecology of when they die is managed. She dies. It's devastating. It's sad, and you watch and respond and see how other animals and people respond to her death, right? What happens to her remains, etc. Obviously, it opens up a whole host of questions and opportunities to understand the ways in which dogs and their lives and indeed their deaths are part of different societies and spaces. But of course, we are also in relationship with them, right? And like you say, they ask us to act, and you can't intervene in every instance. At what point do you go from being a researcher to an activist to a welfarist? What is your clear role here? But also we're people at the end of the day, and I think we're allowed to feel a little bit as long as we are open and honest about when and how our interventions take place. And yeah, what would it have meant to you to have these people speak to you, to know Ruby, and then to go back and find her dead, and knowing you could have intervened? Really complicated. And I don't think that I think you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't in this situation, to be honest. But at least the option you chose meant that Ruby had an opportunity to get well again, right? The researchers are part of the environment.
Yes, definitely. As you pointed out, it was quite a difficult decision. Yeah, you are damned if you do, if you're damned if you don't. Like whom are you responding towards, and like what kind of data are you collecting? For me also, because I was very clear going into the field that I'm not going to intervene in the lives of dogs and people, and I'm just going to observe. And going into the field, it all seemed very simple and straightforward,
Mm.
that I can just be a passive, non participant observer. But when you're in the field, and then you are personally affected by like seeing a lot of things around you, and then people and these animals, like for example Ruby, my research participants, they do like make ethical claims on you, and
Mhm.
you find yourself, or at least I found myself like in obligation towards them, that what was my role in their life. A lot of times it was important to acknowledge that yeah, I was an agent in the field.
Mhm.
I was already impacting the social world around it. I was part of it. And oftentimes we might think as researchers we can try to have a more like a God's point of view and just detach ourselves, but we are like, implicated. And while there is a lot of literature on, especially while doing social research on how to account for like a researcher and researchers' subjective point of views, and how it impacts the data you're able to collect, the access you're able to gain in the field sites, the relationships you're able to make. But then, especially in terms of animals, there is still not that much discussion about the ethical
Mhm.
implication of those relationships, making those relationships or staying away and choosing not to.
Yeah, it's and what I find really interesting is, of course, when it comes to regular ethnography that involves different human groups and people coming from different cultures going in and observing. Historically, this was very much done where this idea that you could go in and observe different peoples to yourself and somehow obtain objective data as though you are not part of the situation has been debunked for a long time. Yet when it comes to beginning to think about these interactions with animals, I think so often we focus on one, this idea of dependency, and two, the practice of feeding, right? So I can definitely understand why you don't want to enact or engage in feeding practices, right? There are numerous arguments both for and against feeding, but that's not the only way in which you are part of the system, right? It ended up being that this whole story with Ruby wasn't really about food; it was about medical care, medical health. But add to that, having listened to you now throughout this series, your presence of just sitting and observing the dogs was impacting perhaps where the dogs were moving, but certainly in some instances how other people were responding to the dogs. So even though you were not necessarily directly giving these dogs food, others saw you watching them and were perhaps more uh, kind or kinder towards the dogs or giving them food or not always. Of course, this is why the longer you spend in the field, the more insight you gain into these practices. But you have an impact on the situation. You're never a detached um, observer. And I think that this is the failure in the labs as well, to return to Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs. The idea that you can kind of remove all of the various factors and aspects and whittle down into very specific behavior leads to really awful, terrible practices, right? Of trying to exclude the complexity. And this reminds me of the conversation I had with Mark Beckhoff on the Animal Turn about cognitive ethology and how important it is to go into the field and watch how animals behave in their own ways, in their own situations, including, I would add, how they respond to researchers being in their space. Really, really interesting work here, Priya.
Yeah, my being present in the fields like also impacted how people also related with the dogs and other animals and how they position themselves towards them. So very interestingly, in the case of Ruby also, when I started, like like giving her medicine, I remember like I got the medicine. I was put it between a piece of bread, and I was trying to feed her at the side of the road. And then there were some people who just like were walking past, and they just stood and started watching. There were some school kids who came and started watching what I was doing.
Mm.
There were neighbors who just like there was a small crowd that gathered and was seeing what I was doing, and they asked me what I was doing and whose dog it was. And then yeah, and then people admitted, oh, we've also been watching this dog suffering, and they said that, oh, we always wanted to do something, but they didn't. So that also happens a lot. You think that okay, you see someone in need often, but then it's very easy because you don't have that personal relationship to think like it's someone else's responsibility.
Yeah, there's a
But yeah,
concept called group think. Actually, I remember in one of my undergrad courses years and years ago, we all kind of convince ourselves that in moments of need or want, we'll be the one that responds. And the lecturer had said, if someone were to come and start having, let's say, a kind of attack of sorts in the front, you like to imagine that you would be the person that would get up and go and help them. But when you're amongst a crowd, what happens is this, exactly as you say, this diffused idea of responsibility. Somebody else will do it. Somebody will do it. And not everybody tends to step up because we are in collectives in this way, which is really, really, yeah, it's good to understand our own psychology in these situations, right? Like we're not these perfect beings that always respond and do things well.
yeah. Now, for me, like that's why, like I think my relationship like differed a little bit from everyone else's. In that market, for example, like I, as a researcher studying Ruby, also had a different kind of relationship
Mm,
was passing by Ruby. So I think that was important for me to take into account.
yeah,
As a researcher, I had some obligation also, and as a
yeah,
person who was present.
exactly. I think that's exactly right. Before you go, so Ruby got better. You gave her the medication and she improved. What happened to her thereafter?
Yeah, Ruby did get better, like her health improved. I was quite pleased that she was taken care of by Lalitaji. Recently, like one of my research participants sent me a video of Ruby from the field, from the village, and she was still like roaming around the market. She no longer stays around Lalitaji's shop anymore. She has found new dog friends, and she explored like other parts of the market. So she has a new place where she stays now, but she is doing well. Yeah, so I'm happy for her. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm happy with whatever I could do
I
for her.
love these life histories, and I love that you've maintained contact with some of your folks in the village, so that you can kind of continue to keep tabs on how these dogs are progressing and what their lives entail. You know, longitudinal studies are really important. Well, thank you again so much, Priya, for all of your work with these animal highlights. I know we've only got one more. Rashmi's going to join us on the next animal highlight, and then we'll be together for a final chat. So thank you so much for all of your work on these animal highlights. I've enjoyed it so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you to Mathew Adams for being an incredible guest, to Priyashnu Epp.Le for a wonderful animal highlight, to Gordon Clark for the bed music, Jeremy John for the logo, Rebecca Shen for her design work, and Christian Mentz for his sound editing work. This podcast is sponsored by Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, and this season by the Remaking One Health Indies project. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Hertenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.